Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Before we dive into tonight's creepy story, don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss a scare. Now, let's get started. I've always enjoyed traveling alone. There's something liberating about being in a new city by yourself, free to explore at your own pace without having to coordinate with anyone else's plans. Last year, I decided to take a trip to San Diego. It was my first time visiting the city, and I was excited to see everything it had to offer: the beaches, the museums, the restaurants. I booked a room at a hotel downtown, a short walk from all the major attractions, thinking it would be the perfect base for my solo adventure. When I arrived at the hotel, everything seemed normal. It wasn't a large, bustling chain hotel, more like a cozy boutique place with a small lobby and friendly staff. As I was checking in, I noticed a man sitting in one of the armchairs near the entrance. He looked to be in his late 40s or early 50s, a little rough around the edges but nothing immediately off-putting. He glanced up from his phone and smiled as I entered, and I smiled back out of politeness. Once I finished checking in, I was getting ready to head up to my room when the man approached me. He seemed friendly enough, just making small talk, asking if it was my first time in San Diego and if I had any plans for my stay. His voice was calm, and he didn't seem threatening, but there was something about the way he looked at me that made me uneasy, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. Before I could find an excuse to politely end the conversation, he offered to help me with my luggage. Now, I'm not one to usually accept help from strangers, but the man seemed insistent in a way that wasn't aggressive but more persistent. I figured it couldn't hurt to let him carry one of my smaller bags, so I agreed. He grabbed my suitcase and followed me to the elevator. We chatted a bit on the way up. I told him about the places I wanted to visit, and he shared a few recommendations, all while keeping a casual tone. When we got to my floor, I thanked him for the help, and he set my luggage down outside the door. He didn't try to linger or push his way into the room, which put me a little more at ease. He simply smiled and said, "Enjoy your trip. Hope to see you around," before heading back toward the elevator. I watched him leave, feeling a mix of relief and confusion. It had been a strange interaction, but not alarming, at least not at that point. I settled into my room, took a shower, and lay down for a short nap before going out to explore the city. I felt safe, though I couldn't quite shake the odd feeling that lingered from my brief encounter with the man. When I went downstairs to the lobby later that afternoon, the woman at the front desk stopped me. She leaned in close and, in a low voice, asked if I knew the man who had helped me with my bags earlier. I told her that I didn't, just that he had been friendly and offered to help. "Well," she said, glancing around nervously, "he's been hanging around outside the hotel for a while before following you in. I noticed him pacing back and forth, like he was waiting for something or someone. It seemed strange, so I thought I should let you know." Her words sent a chill down my spine. Why had he been outside the hotel for so long? Had he been watching me? The woman's concern only deepened my own unease. But not wanting to let fear ruin my trip, I thanked her for the warning and decided to head out for some sightseeing anyway. I spent the next few hours exploring the city. San Diego was beautiful, just as I had imagined, but there was a nagging anxiety at the back of my mind. Every time I walked past someone who looked even remotely like the man from the hotel, I found myself quickening my pace or ducking into a store to make sure he wasn't following me. I felt paranoid, but I kept telling myself that it was just a coincidence, that there was no real danger. After all, I had traveled alone many times before and never had any issues. As the sun started to set, I made my way back to the hotel to freshen up before going out for dinner. I had just finished changing into a new outfit when I heard a knock at the door. It wasn't a loud, aggressive knock, but more of a gentle tap, followed by a man's voice saying, "Housekeeping." Immediately, I knew something was wrong. It was my first day in the hotel, and I hadn't requested any cleaning services. Why would housekeeping be coming to my room at this hour? I moved quietly to the door and looked through the peephole. But to my surprise, there was no one standing there. My heart started racing. I knew it couldn't be housekeeping. Something wasn't right. I grabbed my phone and called down to the front desk, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained what had just happened. The receptionist, now a different woman from earlier, assured me that they hadn't sent anyone up to my room. She promised to send security to check the hallway, and I stayed locked inside my room, anxiously waiting for the knock to come again. Several minutes passed, but no one came. When the security guard finally arrived and knocked on my door to let me know everything was clear, I felt a brief sense of relief, but the tension in my chest never fully disappeared. I thanked him and tried to push the incident out of my mind, convincing myself that it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe someone had knocked on the wrong door, or maybe it was all just a mistake. I went out to dinner, trying to enjoy my meal and distract myself from the unsettling events of the day. After a few drinks, I started to feel a little more relaxed, even managing to laugh at myself for being so paranoid. But as I returned to the hotel that night, a strange sense of dread settled over me once more. It was around 10 p.m. when I got back to my room. I spoke briefly with the new night shift receptionist, telling him about the odd knock and the man from earlier, though by then I felt almost embarrassed bringing it up again. He reassured me that everything seemed fine and promised to check the security cameras. I thanked him, went back upstairs, and tried to unwind. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I lay in bed, drifting in and out of sleep, I felt the mattress shift, like someone had just sat down on the edge of the bed. The sensation of the mattress shifting snapped me out of my half-asleep state. At first, I was disoriented, confused, and trying to rationalize what was happening. Maybe I had moved and caused the bed to creak, or perhaps it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. But as I lay still, holding my breath, I felt the unmistakable pressure of the bed dipping again, as though someone was crawling toward me. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a moment, I was frozen, paralyzed by fear. Every hair on my body stood on end, and a cold sweat broke out across my skin. I wanted to believe it wasn't real, that I was imagining it. But then, I heard a soft rustle of fabric behind me and felt the weight of someone's hand on the blanket near my feet. It was slow, deliberate, like whoever it was didn't want to startle me. I turned my head just enough to see the dark outline of a figure looming over me. He was wearing a baseball cap, and though his face was obscured by a black mask, I knew instantly who it was. The man from the lobby. The man who had helped with my bags. My blood ran cold. Before I could react, he lunged forward, pinning me to the bed. His gloved hand clamped over my mouth, muffling my scream as I thrashed beneath him. The weight of his body pressed down on me, and I could feel the raw strength in his arms as he struggled to keep me still. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do, but panic clouded my thoughts. I kicked and writhed as hard as I could, trying to free myself from his grasp, but his grip was firm, and the more I fought, the tighter he held me down. He leaned in close, and I could smell the stale odor of sweat and something metallic, like rust, on his clothes. His voice was low and threatening as he hissed through the mask. "Don't scream. Don't make this worse for yourself." But I couldn't just give up. Adrenaline surged through me, and I fought with every ounce of strength I had left. In a desperate attempt, I managed to kick my leg out, hitting him hard in the side. He grunted in pain and loosened his grip for just a second, enough time for me to let out a muffled cry. That's when I heard it, a knock at the door, followed by a woman's voice calling out, "Hello? Is everything okay in there?" The man froze for a moment, clearly startled by the sound of someone else outside the door. My heart pounded as I realized that someone must have heard my struggles. I tried to scream again, but the man's hand was still pressed firmly over my mouth. He cursed under his breath, his eyes darting toward the door. The woman knocked again, this time more urgently. "I'm going to call security if you don't answer," she shouted. The man's panic was palpable now. In one swift motion, he released me, bolted to the door, and yanked it open. I saw a blur of movement as he shoved the woman, who must have been another guest, hard, causing her to stumble backward and fall to the ground. Then he darted down the hallway, disappearing into the stairwell before anyone could stop him. I scrambled off the bed, gasping for air, my body trembling with shock. The woman at the door, clearly shaken but not seriously hurt, picked herself up and looked at me with wide eyes. "Oh my God, are you okay?" she asked, rushing inside to help me. I nodded, though my hands were still shaking uncontrollably. My mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. The reality of the situation hit me all at once. I had almost been attacked, or worse, and if it hadn't been for that woman knocking on my door at the right moment, I didn't even want to think about what might have happened. By then, the commotion had attracted the attention of other guests and hotel staff. The woman quickly explained what she had seen, and within minutes, the hotel's security and several staff members were in my room, offering comfort and trying to piece together what had happened. They called the police immediately, and soon after, officers arrived to take my statement. The rest of the night was a blur of questions, paperwork, and shock. I described the man to the police as best as I could, the baseball cap, the black mask, the rough voice, but I never saw his face. The security footage from the hotel was reviewed, but the cameras hadn't captured anyone clearly enough to make a positive identification. Whoever this man was, he had been careful to avoid being caught on film. What the hotel staff did find, however, was even more disturbing. They discovered that the man had used a master key to enter my room. It seemed likely that he had somehow obtained access to the hotel's key system, possibly by stealing or copying a keycard used by employees. This explained how he had gotten inside without forcing the door open or making any noise when he entered. The police took all the evidence they could, but as the hours dragged on, it became clear that finding this man wouldn't be easy. There were no clear leads, no obvious clues to his identity. He had vanished as quickly as he had appeared, leaving behind nothing but fear and confusion. By the time the police left, it was well past midnight. The hotel staff offered to move me to a different room on a different floor, far from where the attack had taken place. They also offered to refund my stay, which I accepted without hesitation. But no matter where they moved me, I knew I wouldn't feel safe again, not in that hotel, and maybe not anywhere for a while. The next morning, I packed my bags and checked out. I had originally planned to stay in San Diego for another few days, but after what had happened, all I wanted to do was leave. The thought of staying in another hotel, of being alone in another unfamiliar room, made my skin crawl. I cut my trip short and flew home, trying to put as much distance between myself and that night as possible. Even now, months later, the memory of that night still haunts me. I replay the events over and over in my mind, wondering what I could have done differently, how I could have prevented it, or whether I was just unlucky to have crossed paths with someone so dangerous. I haven't traveled alone since. The fear and paranoia that followed me home from San Diego have stayed with me, making it hard to trust strangers or feel comfortable in unfamiliar places. The police never caught the man. They never even contacted me again after that night, which only made me more anxious. Was he still out there? Had he done this to other people before, or would he try it again? The questions kept me awake at night, long after the initial terror had faded. I tried to tell myself that I was lucky to have escaped, that things could have been much worse. But even now, the fear lingers. A few years ago, right around Christmas time, I found myself on a plane to Istanbul, alone, and a little too comfortable in my naivety. I was a freshman in college, studying in New York City, miles away from home. For the holidays, I wanted to surprise my family back in Europe. I had been dreaming about that moment for weeks, seeing their faces light up when I walked through the door unannounced. It had been a tough semester, being away from everyone I loved. So this surprise was going to be the perfect way to reconnect, if only for a little while. I remember the day vividly. It was mid-December, just a few days before Christmas Eve. The airport was a chaotic mess, as you'd expect around the holidays, filled with stressed-out travelers hustling to catch flights, dragging suitcases behind them like worn-out pets. I was in a sea of people at JFK, a lone figure pushing through the crowd with a determination that came from the idea of home. Getting through security took forever, and the anxiety of making my flight was gnawing at me. But somehow, after what felt like hours of waiting, the moment came. The gate finally opened for boarding, and I made my way onto the plane. My first flight was from New York to Istanbul, where I'd catch a connecting flight to my home country. The journey was supposed to be straightforward, but as I settled into my seat, something didn't feel quite right. I was sandwiched between two men. To my right, there was a tall, muscular guy with glasses, quietly minding his own business. To my left, however, was someone completely different. He was fidgety, muttering under his breath, and I could feel his gaze on me even though I wasn't looking directly at him. I tried not to overthink it at first, chalking it up to normal travel nerves. But there was something unsettling about him that I couldn't quite shake. I'm not a very big person, barely 5 feet 2 inches, maybe 110 pounds soaking wet, so being squished between these two men was uncomfortable enough without the added tension. The flight was going to be long, over 8 hours, and I was already feeling a little claustrophobic. I did my best to ignore the man to my left and focus on passing the time. I had downloaded a few episodes of American Horror Story to keep myself occupied, and I figured if I just tuned out the world around me, I could make it through the flight without incident. But as I started watching, the man next to me began to make his presence known. At first, it was just a subtle nudge of his arm against mine, then the quiet muttering got louder. I glanced over at him, hoping to signal that I didn't want to engage. But instead of backing off, he leaned in slightly and asked, "Why are you watching a show that's so disrespectful to people like us?" I froze, unsure how to respond. People like us? What did that even mean? He was watching my screen, staring intently at the scene where a character in the asylum was being restrained, screaming. "It's messed up, isn't it?" he continued. "The way they think people who do certain things are monsters. Maybe they're just misunderstood." I forced a nervous laugh, trying to defuse the situation. "I guess it's just entertainment," I said, turning my eyes back to the screen, but my heart was pounding in my chest. I could feel his eyes burning into the side of my face, waiting for some kind of reaction from me. My stomach churned with unease, but I didn't want to make a scene. The rest of the flight was unbearable. He kept stealing glances at me, leaning in just a little too close, his breath hot on my arm. At one point, when I had finally managed to doze off, I woke up with a start to find him staring directly at me, a strange smirk on his face. He didn't say anything, just looked at me like he was studying me, memorizing every detail. It was beyond creepy. I tried to focus on the fact that I'd be home soon, that this nightmare would end as soon as the plane touched down. But the hours dragged on, and every second I was stuck next to this guy felt like an eternity. When the plane finally landed in Istanbul, I practically ran off, desperate to put as much distance between myself and that man as possible. I didn't even look back as I hurried through the terminal, making my way to the gate for my connecting flight. I felt relieved, like I had just escaped something dangerous, though at the time, I couldn't have imagined just how right I was. The rest of the trip went by in a blur. I made it home, surprised my family like I had planned, and for a few days, everything felt normal. I tried to forget about the strange man on the plane, chalking it up to a weird travel experience, nothing more. But that eerie feeling never quite left me. Fast forward to January. The holidays were over, and it was time to head back to New York. I wasn't exactly thrilled about leaving, but the semester was starting soon, and I had no choice. As I was packing up my things, I came across my tote bag, the same one I'd carried on that flight to Istanbul. I hadn't really touched it since then, and as I was going through it, throwing out old receipts and trash, something caught my eye. A small piece of paper, crumpled and tucked into the side pocket. My stomach dropped as I unfolded it, my hands shaking. It was a note, written in messy, scrawled handwriting. It read, "I wish I could see what you look like under your skin." My heart raced, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I had no idea how it got there, but I knew, without a doubt, that it had to have been that man on the plane. He must have slipped it into my bag while I was asleep, while I was completely vulnerable. The thought made me feel sick. I wanted to throw the note away, to pretend I had never seen it, but something stopped me. I stuffed it into my suitcase instead, not sure what else to do. The rest of January passed in a haze. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone was following me, though I knew it was irrational. I kept telling myself that it was just a bad dream, a random encounter with a strange person. Nothing more. Then, in February, my younger sister sent me a news article. The headline was shocking enough. Man arrested for multiple murders, assaults in Istanbul. But as I read further, my blood turned to ice. The description of the man was eerily familiar, the same guy who had sat next to me on that plane. I couldn't believe it. The article detailed how he had been caught after a string of violent attacks, including rape, kidnapping, and murder. He had been targeting women who traveled alone, following them after their flights, stalking them for days before finally attacking. I felt sick to my stomach, realizing just how close I had come to being one of his victims. That note, those unsettling comments, it all made sense now. I had been sitting next to a monster, and I hadn't even known it. The experience left me rattled for months. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on my studies. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, heard his voice in my head, saying those terrifying words. And even now, years later, I still can't shake the feeling that I got lucky, that it could have ended so much worse. It was December 2018, and the winter chill was starting to get unbearable. My girlfriend, Sarah, and I had been talking about taking a break for a while, and with the holidays approaching, we decided to escape to somewhere warm. Somewhere far from the gray skies and freezing temperatures. Mexico seemed like the perfect option: sunshine, beaches, and a chance to relax without a care in the world. We booked a 7-day, all-inclusive stay at a beachfront resort along the Yucatan Peninsula. It was one of those high-end places where everything was catered for: endless buffets, multiple pools, a bar that seemed never to close, and every type of relaxation or entertainment imaginable. The kind of place where people come to lose themselves in luxury. From the moment we arrived, it felt like a paradise. Palm trees swayed in the warm breeze, the ocean stretched endlessly before us, and drinks were handed to us before we could even ask. We spent the first 2 days lounging by the pool, sipping cocktails, and taking in the beautiful surroundings. The resort was everything we had imagined and more. By the 3rd day, however, we started to feel a bit restless. We had seen most of what the resort had to offer, and the idea of simply lazing around for the rest of the week didn't feel as exciting anymore. Sarah suggested that we explore some of the local areas outside of the resort. After all, we were in Mexico, and it seemed a waste not to see more than just the inside of a luxury bubble. The concierge recommended a few nearby towns we could visit, and we decided to rent a car to explore Tulum, a coastal town known for its ancient Mayan ruins and beaches. It sounded perfect, an easy drive from the resort, and the promise of both history and beauty. We rented a small Ford Fiesta from the resort's car rental service, a modest vehicle but good enough for a day trip. As we boarded the shuttle that would take us to the car lot, the driver, an older Mexican man with a weathered face, gave us a bit of advice. "Stay close to the coast," he said in broken English. "Some places not safe. Stay on the main roads." I didn't think much of it at the time. After all, we were staying in a well-trodden tourist area, and there were no major warnings about safety. Besides, this wasn't our first international trip. We were experienced travelers, confident we could handle ourselves. Tulum wasn't exactly what we expected when we arrived. It was busy, but not in the charming way we had imagined. There was a kind of chaotic energy, a far cry from the tranquility of our resort. The beaches were crowded, the roads filled with honking cars, and the ruins, while impressive, were swarmed with tourists. After a couple of hours, Sarah and I both agreed we were ready to head back. On the way back, I spotted a narrow dirt road that branched off from the main highway. It looked like the kind of road that would lead to some hidden beach or quiet place away from the noise. Feeling a bit adventurous, I suggested we take it. Sarah was hesitant at first, remembering the driver's warning, but curiosity got the better of us. We'd rented the car for a reason, right? What's the harm in a little off-the-beaten-path exploring? The road wound through dense jungle, the kind of place where the trees seemed to swallow the light, leaving the path ahead in dim shadow. I kept driving, thinking we might stumble across some secluded spot we could have all to ourselves. It was silent except for the crunch of gravel under the tires, and for a moment, I felt a sense of peace. We had left the chaos behind, and this was exactly what I had been hoping for, a little slice of wilderness, untouched and serene. But that feeling didn't last long. Up ahead, 3 men suddenly emerged from the trees, blocking the road. They weren't dressed like locals, no uniforms or vests that would mark them as workers or guides. No, these men looked rough, with worn clothes and sun-hardened faces that immediately set me on edge. I slowed the car, uncertain of what to do, but they waved us down, signaling for me to stop. Sarah grabbed my arm, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Don't stop. Keep going." But it was too late. One of the men stepped in front of the car, his eyes locked onto mine, and I realized we were in a situation far more dangerous than we had anticipated. One of the men approached the driver's side, motioning for me to roll down the window. I cracked it open just enough to hear what he had to say. In broken English, he demanded money. His tone wasn't polite, it was cold, sharp, and demanding. Then, he pulled something from his pocket, a knife, long and gleaming in the fading light. Panic shot through me. I knew then that this wasn't some misunderstanding or harmless encounter. These men weren't just looking for a tip or directions, they were threatening us. Sarah gripped my arm, her eyes wide with fear. Without thinking, I slammed my foot down on the gas. The car lurched forward, and for a terrifying moment, I thought the man in front of us wouldn't move. But at the last second, he jumped out of the way, his knife slicing through the air as he shouted something in Spanish. The other 2 men chased after us for a few steps, but we were already speeding away, the road ahead a blur as I tried to put as much distance between us and them as possible. I don't remember much of the drive back. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely focus. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see them following us, but the road remained empty. We didn't speak for what felt like an eternity, both of us too shaken to say anything. When we finally reached the safety of the resort, we parked the car and just sat there in silence. My hands were shaking, and Sarah was crying softly. Neither of us could believe what had just happened. We had come so close to something horrible, and the reality of it hit us like a tidal wave. That night, we didn't leave the room. The resort, once a paradise, now felt like a fragile bubble, a thin veil separating us from the dangers lurking just outside. We were supposed to be relaxing, yet I couldn't shake the fear that gripped me. And as we lay in bed, the memory of those men in the jungle replayed over and over in my mind. The next morning, Sarah and I woke up still rattled from the previous day's encounter. Every small sound seemed amplified, the rustle of leaves outside our window, the hum of the air conditioning. My mind kept replaying the image of that knife, the cold look in the man's eyes, and how close we had come to real danger. Despite the comfort of the resort, it felt like a false sense of security now, like the walls weren't thick enough to keep out what waited beyond. Sarah was even more shaken than I was. She suggested we stay within the resort for the rest of the trip, but I wasn't ready to let fear ruin our vacation completely. Besides, we had planned this trip for months, and it felt wrong to let one bad experience steal the rest of our time. I reassured her that we'd stick to safe areas, avoid any more risky adventures, and everything would be fine. That's when one of the staff members at the resort suggested we visit a cenote. "It's very safe," he said, flashing a reassuring smile. "Only about a 30-minute drive from here, and it's a beautiful, peaceful spot. You'll love it." A cenote is an underground water cave, unique to the Yucatan, and the idea of swimming in one sounded magical. Maybe a calm, quiet day away from the resort would help us relax after what had happened. The staff member even gave us a map with directions, explaining that it was a popular destination, so there'd be other tourists around. Hesitant but hopeful, we decided to give it a try. After all, the cenote wasn't deep in the jungle like the previous road we had taken, and I was determined not to let fear dictate our trip. We rented the same Ford Fiesta, which now carried the memories of our close call, but I pushed those thoughts aside. This was supposed to be a fresh start. The drive to the cenote was uneventful at first. The narrow road cut through thick jungle on either side, but this time, it felt more like a guided path than a wild, unpredictable one. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the road. I tried to stay calm, but I could feel Sarah's unease next to me. She kept glancing out the window, as if expecting someone to jump out at any moment. When we arrived, the road ended in a small dirt lot where a few other cars were parked. A hand-painted wooden sign pointed us toward the entrance of the cenote, and a path stretched ahead, leading deeper into the forest. It was quiet, eerily so. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and distant bird calls. I hadn't seen any other people yet, but I convinced myself that they were probably already swimming or exploring nearby. We parked the car, grabbed our things, and began walking toward the cenote. The trail wound through the trees, becoming narrower as we went. The deeper we walked, the more isolated it felt. I started to wonder if maybe we were the only ones here after all. Then, the sounds began. At first, it was just a faint rustling behind us, like footsteps crunching softly in the leaves. I stopped, turning around quickly, but there was nothing, just the empty trail stretching back to the parking lot. Sarah noticed my hesitation and asked, "What's wrong?" "Nothing," I lied, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. "It's probably just the wind." But we both knew it wasn't the wind. The noise continued as we walked, sometimes closer, sometimes further away, always just out of sight. It felt like we were being watched, like eyes were following us from the trees, waiting. We kept walking though, determined not to let our imaginations get the best of us. We reached the mouth of the cenote, a gaping hole in the ground surrounded by jagged rocks and hanging vines. The water below was crystal clear, shimmering in the dappled sunlight. It was beautiful, just like the pictures, but something felt off. There was no one else around. "Maybe they all left?" Sarah's voice was shaky, and I could tell she wasn't convinced. Neither was I. Just then, a figure appeared from behind a large rock near the cenote's edge. He was a man, tall and thin, with dark, sunburned skin and deep-set eyes. He smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes and called out to us in broken English. "You, here for cenote? I show you. This way." I nodded politely, though every instinct screamed at me to turn around. Sarah grabbed my hand, her grip tight and sweaty. We followed him, walking along the rocky ledge toward a narrow path that descended into the cenote. He kept glancing back at us, his smile never fading, but something about him made my stomach turn. He seemed too eager, too insistent. That's when Sarah noticed it. As we walked, she saw a large, curved blade tucked into the waistband of his jeans, half hidden under his loose shirt. It wasn't a small knife like the one from before. It was bigger, more menacing. Her breath itched, and I felt her squeeze my hand tighter. "We need to go," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't argue. Without saying a word, I turned us around, trying to act casual as we made our way back up the path. The man's footsteps followed us, slow at first, then faster. My heart was pounding. I could hear Sarah's breathing quicken, and the panic I had felt the day before began to claw at my chest. We broke into a run. The path seemed longer now, twisting and turning in ways I hadn't noticed before. Behind us, the man's footsteps quickened, and I heard him shout something in Spanish, his voice sharp and angry. I didn't look back, I couldn't. When we reached the parking lot, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly that I almost dropped them. Sarah was already pulling open the passenger door when I finally managed to unlock the car. But as I jumped into the driver's seat, 3 other men appeared from the trees. They were running toward us, shouting, their faces twisted in anger. One of them slammed his hand against the car window, trying to open the door. Another was pulling at the handle on Sarah's side, cursing in Spanish as he yanked it violently. The third raised a rock over his head, ready to smash through the glass. I floored the gas pedal. The tires screeched against the dirt as we shot forward, narrowly missing the men as they jumped out of the way. I didn't stop, didn't look back, just drove as fast as I could down the narrow road, my heart hammering in my chest. Sarah was sobbing next to me, her face pale with fear. We didn't speak until we were back at the resort, safe behind the high gates and security guards. I couldn't believe what had happened. Twice now, we had come so close to something terrible. This wasn't just bad luck. It felt like we were being hunted, like something dark and dangerous had latched onto us the moment we left the safety of the resort. That night, we returned the car and swore we wouldn't leave the resort again until our flight home. When we spoke to the staff, they assured us it was a freak incident, a misunderstanding, but I didn't believe them. Sarah didn't either. We spent the rest of our trip holed up in our room, counting down the hours until we could leave. And when we finally boarded the plane back to the US, I promised myself one thing: I would never set foot in Mexico again.